Okay, so Estuaries, co-creating across disciplines, organizations, and beyond. Our moderator has a beautiful name that I'm going to make the best attempt not to ruin. Opeyemi Olukemi is the executive producer of POV Spark and vice president of the American Documentaries Interactive Unit. She is a fierce advocate of technological equity and has created space and pipelines for artists, communities, and content teams throughout her career. Welcome.
Hi everyone. I'm actually going to invite all of my panelists up to the stage. We're going to shake things up a little bit. We're going to just sit down. So, can you hear me? I noticed a lot of you guys were laughing at Aunt D-Dot, but that's actually adapted from my life, so, you know, I can't wait to talk about our alien takeover in a bit. But I am so honored to moderate this wonderful panel. It's truly an honor to be here. I'd like to first thank MIT and the Cocreation lab team for having us. The funders, of course, and the land that we are currently occupying, and not just because of indigenous people, but because the land itself has a spirit and an energy that has often gone ignored. And because this panel is on estuaries and co-creating across disciplines and organizations and beyond, we are also going to talk about how we, in our practices, embody water, right? So I'm also an Aquarius, so I'm a water carrier. So I'm going to bring astrology and science and all this jazz onto the stage. We have Gina, Jonathan, Christian, and Carlos. Each of them will be introducing themselves in a bit. But there's a bit of structure to this panel. We're going to have quick QAs, followed by a grounding. What the hell are I can even say it, estuaries. And then we're going to then do a few questions. So with that, Gina, do you want to talk a bit about who you are, what you represent, and what brings you to the stage?
Hello everybody. I'm an artist, and I believe why I'm here is having a conversation about a piece of work called Heirloom, which I made, which is a co-authorship between myself and a bioscientist, John Hunt, where we created skin portraits of my daughters from stem cells taken from buccal swabs of their inner cheek, from just buccal swabs. And in that we created a system for sustaining life outside of the laboratory, so it was developed with Copenhagen Medical Museum, where we could grow these skin portraits within the gallery, which grew over time, and we learned eventually how to moderate them over the time of the gallery exhibition. Also, it was a new way to grow stem cells from a non-invasive procedure. Normally you take a plug. Anyhow, I'm rattling on. It's really about the kind of co-authorship and collaboration which has happened throughout my practice, always with new different partners, dancers, biomedics, scientists, musicians, and so on. And most recently, with the current projects, it's with business, IP, lawyers, and engineers, product designers, and manufacturers.
Thank you, Gina. Christian.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Christian, and I'm formally probably a cognitive science. Informally, I'm probably more like a philosopher gone rogue or activist. And I work primarily within healthcare and education. And the reason why I do that is because I believe when we do science or when we do research, it's also fundamentally that is rooted in lived experience. And for my own personal experience is that my girlfriend and now wife, through 15 years, has a terminal illness called cystic fibrosis. And all the experience I've had with the healthcare system, I thought something needed to change. And the education-wise, I always struggled with educations. All the knowledge, forms of knowledge I could contribute was not recognized. So I thought once more I needed to do something. So of course what I did, which is what I could do, was I went to academia. And then I did my PhD and all these things, and then I was hired in a private healthcare institute working as a head of research for brain damage and physical disability. But what I quickly realized was there's not that much collaboration for that in the more radical co-creation sense in academia or in the private healthcare institute. So what I wanted was to open this up to the communities. I wanted voices into the mix. I wanted people that lives with physical disability, that feels the same things I felt as a relative. I wanted to include that, and that was the reason why I started to work with storytellers, because if there's somebody that can engage people, it's storytellers. So I've now worked collaboratively with documentary film, art installations, theater plays, and all these things. And what I do right now, which is probably the most, for me at least right now, sitting in this, the most interesting example on this is that 1.5 years ago, the head of the art section at the Kronborg Castle, which is also famously the Hamlet's Castle, to be or not to be, he came to me and said, "Chris, can you help me make Shakespeare relevant?" And I was like, no way. Why would I do that? I have no interest in Shakespeare, and at that moment I thought it was very elitist and very colonial and very Western. But then he said, I want to do a play about Richard III. It's about disability. It's about experience and what it means to be disabled. And then I got really intrigued and invited two of my good friends called Jacob and Casper, who live with cerebral palsy, which is a physical disability, into the mix. And all of a sudden, we applied for some seed money and we traveled the whole world to figure out how can we reinterpret a very colonial Western story about what it means to be disabled depicted in Shakespeare. So we did that, Lars within the art, me within science, and Jakob and Casper within communities. And what we figured out was, it's the wrong story. What's actually happening here is not about disability, it's about ability, it's about agency, it's about identity. It was something totally different, that what we quickly found out was, whoa, we need to reorganize how we do these co-creation processes. We need to engage these people around the world in South Africa.
I'm just gonna pause for a second. So that's gonna go later to the panel.
Yeah.
But thank you for that. Carlos, please introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Carlos. I'm from Spain, living in the US for a few years and in a few different places. I'm not sure why I'm here, which probably is a good thing, right? I'm guessing. My background is in journalism and design, and I no longer know what I am. I just and I don't care. So just learn to. I'm just learning to listen and to be in dialogue and moving along, which is not easy, but I guess that's what.
Thank you, Carlos.
Gosh, that's beautiful. Hi, my name's Jonathan. Also having epic imposter syndrome right now. I'm really, really honoured to be here on a panel with you guys, and also, everyone else in this room. It's a really, really, really exciting space. My name's Jonathan. I'm an arts programmer and producer based in London. Just to give you an idea of trajectory, because I think it's interesting we're talking about multi-disciplines, and I think knowing where someone comes from kind of sometimes helps place them. So I come from a theatre and performance background, largely kind of performance art and devised theatre, so where there's not necessarily a play text or a strict director who's pushing things or an authorial line. It's about people bringing their lives, fragments of text, movements, ideas into a space, and then you kind of create a performance over a painful year of trying to figure out how to work together. I went from that world into festival producing. So I worked for 5 years with a festival called Lift in London, which is the London International Festival of Theatre. Again, looking at new forms of performance and theatre. And there, I don't know whether it was because I was the most enthusiastic or the least scared, I ended up becoming their digital producer because I was comfortable working in multidisciplinary environments and comfortable working with technologists and musicians and all sorts of different things. And it was interesting that the term digital producer quickly became anything that doesn't fit into a normal theatre box. So I'd bring musicians in to work with theatre actors. I'd bring UX designers in. I produce games-based theatre, online-based theatre, all the way to flying 7 hot air balloons across the city at dawn with speakers strapped to the side, each playing a different part of a musical score that had been composed with sleep scientists to stimulate your REM dream sleep. it's like meant to stimulate your REM dream sleep, but really it's a beautiful spectacle in the morning. Now, I currently work at the British Council, which in their arts team, which for those of you who don't know is an independent charity that's set up to support linking the UK with the rest of the world. It's a big, old, 80-year-old, dusty institution, which is often well-meaning, profoundly problematic in places, and their arts team is divided into art forms in a very traditional sense. You have the theatre team, you have the music team, you have the literature team, all kind of serving established industries. I'm in a team that's a multidisciplinary team called the Creative Economy team, where we're exploring ideas of co-creation and ideas of collaboration, ideas of new disciplines and new technologies that don't necessarily fit into industry contexts. And I'm about to embark on a fellowship next year, which is super, super exciting. So where I'll be looking at multidisciplinary practice and new forms of collaboration and new forms of creative leadership.
Fantastic. So we basically have theater, we have journalism, we have philosophy and science, and we have art, right? And a few of our panelists were like, well, why are we all here? But one, when Kat asked you to come to MIT, you say, okay, of course, Kat, we're definitely gonna do this. But I think what MIT is really trying to address is what is actually the purpose of co-creation? And our panel is called Estuaries because it's quite important. Are there any marine biologists here? Anyone? Okay, so it's basically when you have fresh water and salt water converging. And what basically happens is because the salt water has a different salinity point, it's very dynamic, and there's different nutrients that allow the ecosystem to flourish. So if you have a breakdown across the world, 60% of the population live near to these regions. So likewise, when we try to figure out new forms of artwork or new forms of creation, it usually happens when you have a dynamic energy, people of different disciplines coming together. So Gina, I would love to start with you to go a bit further about your individual collaboration, because more one-on-one with you and a scientist, and we'll go deeper into how we can also expand into hackathons and journalism. And then with you, Kristian, we'll also discuss how working with organizations and governments can also allow this process to flourish.
Where to start? I've done a number of long-term projects with a number of scientists who I all call long-term collaborators, because we're all still in touch. And for us, it's really about mutually beneficial ideas and engagement and works. And it isn't about the same objective or the same outcome, but something that's mutually beneficial. With John, who I made Heirloom with, and with the Medical Museum, and with my daughters, so it's a kind of wider collaboration. It became significant in that the journey became playful and it changed as my daughters got older. So signing away consent for them to be used as part of my artwork to get their stem cells was quite funny when we were collecting their eyelashes in milk in a jar, but when they're 17 and see their own images given back to them by their friends on Facebook, it became less funny and more problematic. The whole idea of consent is what drove a lot of my work, particularly since moving to Liverpool in 2006 from Melbourne. And Liverpool was the starting point of what became called the aldehyde organ scandal, which was practice kind of worldwide where researchers would take samples of cells to research. But in Liverpool, an aldehyde was a children's hospital, and it became known as body parts in jars, and created a scandal which then went on to change the Human Tissue Act, which in turn changed the way that researchers could actually use cells for investigation. So the whole ethics procedure became a lot longer. It prevented a lot of valuable research. And at the same time, I did a project called Wasted, which was, Wasted and Liverpool go hand in hand in many different ways. It's a stag do and hen do town. But it was called Wasted, about looking at what waste really is. And I became also interested in this in making dance film in Ghana, where I visited for the second time. There's lots of plastic rubbish all around. And my friend looked at me and said, well, it depends what you consider waste. Last time you were here, we didn't have to plastic waste. but we had cholera. And I'm really, it's about the definition of a weed, and weed by definition is something you don't want. So that changes in relationship to where you are and what you believe in and what you think. I'm kind of Anglo-Polish. My dad's a survivor of a concentration camp. We grew up in England white, so culturally very different, but looked the same. And I think the kind of whole melting pot of stuff, I never went out to be kind of transdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary or making hybrid works. I just make work and I'm always surprised it doesn't fit anywhere. So it's great to find myself amongst like-minded people. Suddenly you find a home. So the Aldehay organ scandal was a trigger to the wasted works, which looked at how we could use medical waste. So it's taking hip bones and fat. I mean, this gets more and more disgusting, so it's great if I have breakfast. Stuff that people didn't want, didn't need, didn't use, and didn't identify with. Because you look at your features and your physical thing. If you look in your mouth, people are horrified and don't want to give away their mouth casts. But give away your hip bone or your fat, it's not identifiable to us, to general people. So they didn't mind. So I ended up with some hip bones, but had to go through a 4-year process of getting consent with the Queen's orthopaedic surgeon, with the Kennedy Institute, with religious leaders, the canon of the Catholic and Anglican cathedrals, with the Aldehay parents, so parents of the Aldehay victims, so-called, and the only people who said I couldn't or it was wrong to use human tissue in art was the Natural History Museum, London, who objected on the basis they wouldn't supply us with their domestic lardarius beetles to clean the bones. It became such a funny exercise that I became really fascinated, and the documentary I really want to make is where science fact is so strange that it's greater than any fiction you could ever make up. So that work led to the Heirloom works, which was just really, I thought was something technically possible, easy to do, and it turns out it's not. Where I'm at now is I found there's a whole resource of media, cell media, that's out of date, can't be used for research, can't be used for control models, it's sat in fridges, it gets dumped, could be used for artists working with generating cells, and I'm interested in how we kind of make it possible for people to experiment with new media in a safe way, but in a way that enables cross-exploration between art and science. So the Heirloom project goes on in a medical sense. It's the way where you can grow three-dimensional skin, which, if you don't know, that most skin plasters are grown in flat surfaces and then they're bent to shape on the human form, and in that the skin cells distort. So if you can grow them in 3 dimensions, then they don't distort, they're still elastic and they retain their structure, which means that children with burns on their faces can have their faces 3D scanned and their own skin grown in 2 weeks and applied to those burns with no scarification. It's phenomenal. And we're getting there with 3D printing, and I'm really excited about that and what it can do for leishmaniasis victims, in Syria, things that we don't hear about, with the scarification. So I'm interested in the kind of medical application of something that evolved out of an artwork that I couldn't believe wasn't already done. Am I making sense? and also in ways where I didn't realise that growing living skin outside of the laboratory was something that other people hadn't done, and with simple ubiquitous technology like tropical fish tank technology, we actually made something that worked, and it's about giving that process away or making it accessible to other people to use, to experiment with things in a safe space that can then help and inform experiments in science as well.
And you covered a lot. You mentioned consent and the need for trust, and also how you can expand, and we're going to go a bit deeper after we ground everyone else, but that was great, so thank you for that, Gina. Something that's very interesting about estuaries too is that it's really usually when rivers meet the sea. So it's a transition period, right? And this question is going to be for you, Jonathan. So with my former employer at the Tribeca Film Institute, in 2011, I was tasked to bringing Documentarians into the world of technology, and that was perhaps one of the hardest things I had to do. So I'm curious, from your expertise, what were some of the ways you entered new collaborations, and how did you facilitate different disciplines to come together and create?
Thank you. Definitely, I don't know if expertise might be a little bit high. I think I've managed to. It's really interesting that's sprung from talking about trust, because obviously we know when you're working with practitioners from different industries, either whether they're different art disciplines or whether they're from completely different worlds, be them scientists, be them technologists or developers, like they're very, very different timescales, very, very different motivations for working, very, very different motivations and ideas for how collaboration takes place. And so, the reason why the expertise thing I'm kind of uncomfortable with is because I think, largely I've been just really, really fortunate and blessed through life that I've managed to kind of take what felt like a bit of a kind of a diagonal trajectory until we talked earlier about some of your practices and some of the training that you guys have had, and I realised I've actually been quite firmly in the arts world. But just being very generous, very open, and trying to create, like a lot of what I do now at British Council is creating these kind of environments for collaboration. So sometimes they're hackathons, sometimes they're kind of collaborative residencies. Sometimes they're round tables, or but it's all about trying to create an environment that's trusting and that's generous. And actually, there were two quotes that I brought along, which kind of connect with this quite nicely. So I might read them now. And we discussed this earlier, but one of them is from you, so I hope you'll forgive me for reading your words in front of everyone. Hold on, let me just put it up. Better be worth the wait. Okay, yeah. So you said in Kat's Kat's document that she sent round, which I'm really looking forward to reading the full final version of, that co-creation is the ability for people to humble themselves and let their guards down to create something that they cannot do by themselves. Co-creation allows, perhaps, I hope, a way into a process that gets you closer to reclaiming your humanity. And I find that quote really, really interesting because, it talks about trust, it talks about intimacy, it talks about opening yourself up. And I just finished reading All About Love by Bell Hooks. And, in that she talks about the idea of love. This is going back to Kamal as well earlier, the idea that love is not a state. So for Kamal to stand on stage and say, I love you all, even if I've not met you, I love you all. She's not talking about a stage, she's talking about a practice, she's talking about a relational way of being with other people, and a generosity to feed someone else's spirit and to have your spirit and horizons fed yourself. And I think that really speaks profoundly to the kind of environments that you need to create for co-creation, or for these estuaries to work. So people feel like they can support each other, people feel like they can let their guard down and try something different. But then that connects to one other really quick quote that I'd like to read, which is, because I've been thinking about co-creation, I've been going back to my devised theatre roots. And I was doing some reading before I came here, and there was a great quote that I keep returning to, a guy called John Ashford, who used to run the Place Theatre in London. And he said about devised theatre, which is like a co-created form of theatre, he said that devised theatre is a compromised art, a mucky, mutable, dirty, competitive, collaborative business. I have no idea if he means that as a positive thing or as a negative thing, but I like to take it as a positive thing because, it is messy, and life is messy. Life is messy and it's full of misunderstandings, and these kind of creative environments, because people are motivated by very different things and coming to it from very different perspectives, there are loads and loads of misunderstandings. But I really trust the discoveries you make in those misunderstandings. They're often really sublime discoveries because you're discovering them together, and because you're working together to find these things and relating with each other. And they co-creative environments, for me at the moment anyway, especially with I'm thinking about this fellowship that I have coming up. I'm really interested in thinking more about social practice and activism within art spaces and within arts practices. It's something that I've probably engaged with less, and I'm really keen to kind of step into that a little bit more. And it feels like these co-creative spaces, because they're often about difference and about relating to difference, it's something that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment.
That's wonderful, thank you. And Carlos, are you still like a little at loss at why you're here?
I can try.
So from your viewpoint with journalism, and the fact that for the most part you guys have been collaborative for decades, but yet your industry is in flux, how does this ability to work outside of disciplines affect your work, or what have you seen in the field in general that can also add to this conversation?
I don't know exactly if I'm going to answer that question, sorry, but I'm going to try. So for some research I did as a fellow at the Tau Center for Digital Journalism, I look at collaboration in journalism. So there's a lot of interesting work on that. But I thought, I just want to take a step back and think if I can come up with a framework. Frameworks are always, I think, interesting, also limiting, right? Just setting some boundaries. So that's, we're trying to find a safe place for us to. So it's probably rejecting, to some extent, the ambiguities and the uncertainty of the world, but you can try to find a way of thinking through problems, right? So collaboration, as you were saying, it's been in journalism and has had a role in journalism for forever, I guess. But I think in the last, let's say, 3 decades, have played a different role. And the role to me, it's in being critical in reshaping the material and the social conditions for journalism. So we live in a different world, and I think we can try to explain the critical role of collaboration in enabling and in driving change. So I think, to me, helps me think about the change in journalism as an evolving thing, as a flow, instead of a static thing. And then I think a critical place for me to stay, to like put the different pieces through the framework of the commons. So the commons connect different phenomena, and it's basically a social system of shared resources that required cooperation to make it sustainable. So that's the way I'm thinking about journalism. After that, like, path, like it started from collaboration and ended up in thinking, okay, this is a social system with shared resources, and I think that's critical it has very practical consequences. And that was my first motivation in doing this research. I've been involved in creating new things many times. Most of them fail, by the way, but we'll learn. And I hope we didn't create a big mess. But so I've been involved in different things. It was interesting. How can we allocate resources? How can we invest for the long term when we are doing stuff, managing resources in a media organization, in journalism, in non-profits? My current work is on press freedom, documenting press freedom violations globally, and advocating on behalf of journalism and press freedom. So how do we allocate resources which are always limited? That was my first motivation, and then I thought, this has very practical implications. In any commons, what is at stake is equity, access, sustainability, and requires cooperation and requires different rules of governance to think of how to make things happen. So if we think of very simple problems as net neutrality, that's strictly connected to press freedom and to journalism. So we can start thinking about social dilemmas or dilemmas that are around journalism as social problems that require cooperation, and then we stop thinking in terms of private, public, not in market or public incentives. We think of different ways of enabling an infrastructure for journalism and make it happen that has collaboration at the center. So the bottom line is, like, it started looking at collaboration, and then I realized that collaboration is no longer maybe this is not the right word, an attribute, but it's at the center of the system. It will make it sustainable. And to me, it's just, sorry to emphasize that this is the way, to me, to thinking about journalism today: equity, access, sustainability. And I feel those 3 things are sometimes on the sides. We're focused on other things, but those are the underlying basic problems, and all require collaboration.
Wonderful, and I think my last panel of the day, or for this panel, will be on that issue. But next but not least, Kristian. So we had a great breakfast this morning when you were telling us about your business practices and how you look at problems of the world, how you choose to engage and build and move on. If you can continue on your introduction to talk about what you've been doing and especially working with large-scale organizations, how that also has been empowered through the co-creation process.
Yeah. Yeah, so the reason why, first to say, which is very important to me, the reason why I get so passionate and talk about these things is because also personally it works. It simply works going into these co-creation processes. But the biggest issue for me, and now it's maybe it's more comfortable to talk about it here, as you also said, where there's like-minded people. But coming within healthcare, medicine, coming in more medical foundations and being in academia, these are the stories they tell. Everything has to be now co-creation. Everything has now to be collaboration. And as I mentioned this morning, when you apply for EU funding, like in Horizon 2020, collaboration is mentioned 95 times. 95 times. But when you're then at the board of trustees presenting you, they really don't understand what it is. They talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. What they don't understand for me, and that's the biggest issue here, for me at least, is that they don't understand processes, they don't understand the method, and then we discussed this morning, should they actually understand it? That's something we can maybe discuss later, but what I quickly found out was within like a triangle of maybe the academia, the private industry, or maybe within arts and media, I couldn't find an organization that could work with this third space. So what I did, I panicked a bit and then I started an NGO. So in order to figure out how can I do this, and what I did was trying in relation, for example, with the big project with the castle, with the Elsinore Castle, the Hamlet Castle, was how can we scale this up to a global setup? Because right now we have partners from engaged in the process, traveling around the world. We have partners from Sydney, from Mumbai, from Delhi, from London, UK, Surrey, New York, Boston, Rio, Cape Town, Johannesburg. But how can we continue to engage them so these are not just scientists or researchers in it? These are not just community activists within disabilities. These are not just artists or media people, but these are actually a common space, as you say, a commons where we work not as disciplines or as, so to say, the way we understand ourselves, but as towards a common goal. Within cognitive science, we typically define this as working towards a joint problem space. It's a problem that is for all these people I've seen here, and that's the incentive structure driving these people. We are working towards a same goal, namely reinterpreting the narrative and the paradigm for what it means to be disabled. And that's difficult to do with the infrastructure. Both, I'm not an artist as such, I work with artists, so please correct me when I'm wrong, but I think it's also difficult to do right now with the infrastructure within art and funding within art, but it's definitely difficult to do within academia. I struggle day and day to get them to understand the lived experience is also knowledge. It's not just science and facts, that's also knowledge. But there's lots of complexity to these things. And what I want to do is to work with an organizational structure where this is allowed and where co-creation is allowed. It's not just a buzzword you use, but as we also saw historically this morning, the reason why it continues to do is because it actually works, or at least for me.
So to add on to that, even if it's on an organizational level or it's a global level, there's still something very, very special when you bring people together to focus on an issue at hand. So this is a question for you and Gina, and you can tag team. I'm curious, how can you protect the end product from external influences that may not understand the importance of this co-collaboration or the delicate nature of what you are trying to achieve?
I actually don't know what the end product is until I made it. I mean, it's a journey, and most of the work has grown through collaboration, which has been purposeful collaboration, or the odd conversation, which has changed my understanding about the whole world, just in one sentence. So I'm surprised about the outcomes. What I do have to protect is the interpretation of that outcome, and that isn't And the art world is guilty of that as well, because there's so many egos in the kind of curatorial world that want to fit your thing into their thematic. So it's really about protecting the individuals, as somebody else was saying before, people whose stories want to be told, and it's protecting everybody involved and their story and how they want to be perceived. And if you can make an outcome which everybody's proud of, and it's gone on a journey which you never expected, but ultimately it achieves more than you ever could have imagined at the beginning. So for example, with Heirloom, it was a portrait of Alexei Sale's face, because he was famous and I thought it would get a load of media hits. Turns out, the day that my daughters went to give their stem cells from their buccal swabs, I was in hospital having a hysterectomy, so it changed the whole nature of the work, and it got retitled Heirloom, about something you pass down of value. And as an artist, it's questionable, because I wanted to highlight the whole thing about value, and not necessarily in monetary terms, but what globally children inherit. And like what you put in the earth, your kids have to walk on, all that kind of stuff. So the work changes as you make it, and I think that keeps it alive, because with the whole funding scheme, you say what you're going to make and then you make it. If you know the funding scheme well, you say what you're going to make and you make something far better that might have no relationship to what you originally set up. And everybody's happy. Thank you, Gina.
I can add something. I think make it sustainable, this work, it's critical, right? So we move from the experiment to stable component of our work. And I think we can learn a lot from how engineers have worked in the past, how human-centered design have been stable, like, or have been formalized around a framework. So there's something that I work in non-profit, in for-profit, in whatever, many different places, and you have to make it business-friendly. That's something, when you're a manager, you need to find out the way of making it business-friendly, which means explaining it in a way that seems sustainable. That doesn't need to mean that you're making a lot of money, that might not be the end goal, and I found that sometimes, I mean, you can get a lot of buy-in, but finding the way you're explaining those, and the way you're measuring things, even if you don't know, you make explicit the assumption you're making. And I think at the end, we can learn a lot from the human-centered design folks and the very successful businesses that have been created, at least from the 80s, I think. So not to put like the less appealing part, but we have to make it business friendly.
And I agree, and Christian, if you can expand,
Yeah.
even if we're able to create business models to create sustainability, how do you still protect the process or the product or that natural exchange? So,
To me, the main inspiration I'm taking is from the human-centered design people. I don't want to mention, but there are obvious things, and some of them have been personal influences for me. When I was based in the West Coast, those people, sometimes the messages have been distorted outside of that, but I think the basics are there. They're still approaching the work as makers in their small shop building things, but they've been able to build a framework to protect that process, to protect their personality, their identity, but building a business around it.
And to answer that, I actually agree with you, Gina, that on content level, we never know what the outcome in these co-creation processes are. That doesn't mean we don't have criteria for a form level. There are structural ways of doing these things and looking at how we structure the processes of an outcome. And what is most important for me is always, and that's how typically within academia and science you do contracts. You set these things up, and I guess you also do that within the art world with the funders and all these things. The most important, so to say, criteria for me to set up a structure around the process is that whatever outcome we come out with, this is something that is meaningful and can be related to the people we work with, the people we have engaged. They can see themselves represented in the outcome. They can see their voices heard in these things. And then the whole idea is not to just have maybe one outcome, but actually playing with what outcomes means, and playing what formats means, and playing what platforms can be. And what is most interesting for me has always to be that these lived experiences or voices, they are very difficult to be heard in an academic article. So also to play with what is knowledge and how does it get out there, so that the people we're working with can actually get engaged with this and play with them. Then there's no sort of say other sort of a big criteria for me than that, and then making sure, and I totally agree with that, making sure that this is also on a legal level and a business level, this is ensured. But you can always claim like the scientific aspect to that as well.
Wonderful. So Jonathan and Carlos, this next question is for you. So estuaries are also known to create brackish water, which is basically allowing the water to pass through the land and removing the salt so we can consume it. So I'm also curious that through this co-creation process, how can you take an idea or the filtered ideas of this process and expand it to a larger demographic? I know it's a heavy question, Jonathan.
I can always try. So the basics, I think, for me, is the people you work with. So that's where I put all my focus. If you are focused on helping them do their best work and create a dialogue that focus on a positive environment, and that's all. I think then my role is done. I truly believe, like, if you really put the focus on who are you hiring, who are you working with for that project or for a larger venture, there are gonna be ripple effects. There are gonna be positive things coming. Probably it's difficult to measure those things. It's very difficult to make those things explicit at the beginning of the process, but when I was working in environment, trying to create transformation in from more traditional business environment to digital environment, which is something a lot of companies, organizations, sectors are embracing these days, right? Trying to move into whatever they need to move in, to be. And I think the only focus for me is the people you're bringing in, how you're supporting them, how you're helping them gain new skills, are you helping them communicate, are you helping them stay in dialogue and be agents of change in a good way, by listening, by cultivating empathy. So I think it's hard to plan for that, but focusing on the people, which in journalism, and I think in every other sector, but in journalism is the core piece. Everything is about human resources, everything is about people, equity, access, inclusion, what we really mean with diversity, what we really mean with building on each other's work. That's to me the focus on everything, and on this initiative, the main thing is the human capital you create.
That's what you're talking about in terms of momentum and commitment really stuck with me there. I had a great conversation with a friend of mine, Jana, who has a studio, and she runs hackathons, or not really hackathons, kind of workshops where she'll bring in artists, technologists, musicians, and they'll have a certain theme or they'll have a certain issue, and then they'll have 24 hours, 48 hours, the traditional model to come up with an idea based on it. And it can be kind of tech-based that's a little bit creative, or it can be art-based that's a little bit techy. They're not prescriptive about what that is. And she was telling me about a project they did recently. It was really, really interesting scenario. They were looking at domestic abuse in Bulgaria, and they had this one particular story. I don't know if I want to share it. It's not very pleasant. Basically, a woman who was beaten to death by her partner or husband in a flat. It was really, really loud. Everyone in the building heard, and nobody did anything. And the murder lasted an hour. And so and she comes from a journalism background actually, and so they use that as the framing for this piece and for this workshop. Sorry. And the piece that came out of it was an art installation. It was I think they got the best drummer in Bulgaria, and they worked with the technologists to hook up each drum, and they recorded people's screams, and so the installation was this drummer, and every time he hits a drum, it triggers the sound of a scream. That was what came out of the 24, 48 hours. From there, they continued to work together, and they decided to take the loose idea of that concept and actually put it in the building. So they Airbnb'd a flat in that building. I think it was just above or just below the flat where the murder happened. And they put a drummer in the space, and they made a short video where they had the drummer playing. And they wanted to see how long it would take for someone to respond to that noise and to come and knock on the door and say, "What the hell are you doing?" And they've made this, and so they did that kind of intervention, and they made a short video out of it. I think it took about 1 minute and 20 seconds for someone to come and knock on the door and say, "What is that noise? Turn it down." And then they turned that into a film, which they distributed across Bulgaria, and then through that kind of process, and that it came up with like a campaign essentially that really got people talking about it, and it made it on all of the daytime talk shows, and it suddenly got a huge reach. Sorry, it's not the most cheerful of things to share on stage. I feel a bit conflicted about it, but I think it's a really interesting example of how so often, and I'm really guilty of it, so often when I'm able to kind of make these co-creation spaces, they're very limited in time, and then they stop, and then people disperse, and that has a value. I come from a festivals background, so I really believe in the idea of bringing people together for a short space of time, and then temporary autonomous zones. There's a value in that, but I think increasingly there needs to be, if we want to help develop these communities and develop these ideas, I think having a commitment to continue working together and to take things to the next stage and to the next stage is really, really valuable, and can create things of more reach and more impact, if that's how you're thinking about impact.
So I'm definitely hearing commitment and business models and a way to make this sustainable. So let's talk about the next 3 years, about collaboration, co-creation. What do you think are the essential tenets that are needed on a community level, to a global level, to allow this to continue to flourish and to ensure that we have people that are able to expand the thought, expand the filtration process, and bring great ideas to the masses? And because of your face, Kristian, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. So I actually think, which is probably also the reason why all of us are here, that for me at least, the story has to be tightened up a bit. And that's the reason why with all the work that's doing here at the Co-Creation Studio, that is really, really good for me. Because right now, the word we're using, it's also used for many others. It's used as sometimes, as people say, it's a buzzword. So either there's two things we can do here. Either we can leave it alone, or we can tighten it up. So actually set up some maybe criteria, doing a history, figuring out what does it mean to do co-creation, what does it mean to do collaboration on these things. So for me, it's always starting with the words we use to create a new story or paradigm. That's one thing. Another thing, next 3 years, whoa, that's difficult. I think, or at least that's the thing I've been doing a lot in Denmark, in the EU, is trying also to get the funders to understand what this entails, especially what it entails that typically when you do a fundraising, they want to know the outcomes, and typically I go into, I don't know, which is a bad way to get money actually, so don't do that. But it's also to like tighten up what does it mean, could we have different kind of funding models that could actually let it be okay that there's a process, there's a co-creation process we are now tightening up, but maybe on the outcome, on the content level outcome, it's fine, we don't know yet. So that's one thing, maybe having funders to work also with or the business models to work with. How could they look? Could they also be different? If we are now in the co-creation setup trying to rethink disciplines and formats and all these things, we should probably also rethink it on the business and the funding level. So that's definitely also one thing I think, yeah.
I was just notified we have 10 minutes left before QA, so I have 3 more questions, but let's see if we can answer them all. Okay, so... Oh, okay. So let's talk about the future. Let's expand, kind of fast forward. So we have climate change upon us, right? So how can we make sure that collaboration is still at the forefront, especially when we have material resources decreasing? And I'm not saying that collaboration will decrease, I think will actually increase, but in a way where there's more scarcity, where there's water being unfortunately not made accessible. What are key ways, and if you can make it short, that would be great, that we can really focus on increasing access, especially in a time of deep limited resources? Go for it, Gina.
Sorry, but I'm going to have to talk about my new project. For the last 5 years, I've been working on a way which is about sustainable practice for an artist. And we're lucky to have the Arts Council, and with austerity that's decreasing, and arts organisations and artist-led organisations are being dismantled on a weekly basis now. So for the last 5 years, with complicit with the Arts Council, I've been developing an artwork come business. And the business is about the funeral industry and the monopoly in the funeral industry and the corruptness and Victorian nature of it. And it sounds awful, but I've made a new coffin, which is the most biodegradable one imaginable, at cost, and decorated by people. So it's a collaboration with 20 artists across the UK that made designs on my based coffin that can be paraded on Mexican Day of the Dead, which is 1st of November, through Liverpool as a kind of protest. Like, it isn't illegal to block traffic to carry a funeral procession out, so we're just carrying out 20. And also it's been working with businesses, and at the beginning you start with hiding behind male engineers, and it's only when I came out as a female artist with no experience of product design, engineering, design or anything like that, that we actually started talking and working, and now that's the biggest European manufacturer. A material that's developed from lignin, which is the second most sustainable. It's like waste product. It comes from tree bark, but mine comes from the, when you make egg cartons, from recycled paper, the liquid that comes out of that, and it's as hard as plastic. It makes 17%. The research into the funeral industry is amazing. The coffin handlers got it last week, and they said it's really great. It's really light. It doesn't. Oh, blimey! It doesn't creak or squeak or leak. And you can imagine, we can also sell it for less than about 350 quid. It's all kind of locally made, it's using a local printer, it's using local cloth makers, local artists. It's really about getting local artists to design and make things. What I've noticed on the process is that, okay, I get 20 ideas from artists all over the UK, every single one of those contacts me on a very regular basis, and it's become a very personal journey for them. And one particular woman who isn't an artist, she's a nurse, it's made her go through she wants to put photographs on it. So it's teaching her how she can do it herself, giving access to people on the web. We're making 3D bits that you can add on with the Fab Lab idea. So we're printing bits that make it into a Viking longboat, a sphinx, a racing car. And it's all available to download. Obviously, we make the coffin. You can also put it on your roof rack, canoe in it, camp in it. But it's actually trying to work business a different way, because I'm not a businesswoman. I work on a parallel system, and now we're trying to get those really high-level engineering companies who worked with me for 3 years, believing in it, to become kind of partners within that, not in a kind of high-level way. And we've got a Kickstarter going so we can keep out those one and only investors that want to control the way we work, because the cheaper it gets for us, cheaper it gets for people who want to buy it. And I've been laughed at a lot about that, and it's about sticking to your sense of purpose and morality. Yeah.
One last comment. Anyone else have anything to add before we go into QA? No? Christian did. QA time. Okay, is that Joe Brewster? Who's that in the back? I can't see.
No, it's Sultan.
Sorry, hi Sultan. Sorry, Joe.
I would make all black men don't look like Joe. No.
Classic.
I'll leave you alone. Hey, good to see you again. So I have a question. You talked earlier about sort of the wrestling with these sort of edges when you're crossing institutional lines. And then Opeyemi, you also spoke earlier about making space for people of color, people who might be coming from traumatic experiences. One thing that I've encountered a lot working in this space and co-creating between sort of working in inner city Detroit with youth, and then MIT and in the nonprofit sector, and some there are different sort of cadences for communication. Like we could be designing back home on the block, and you might get into an argument, and then that's just a normal creative process, and you come back the next day and work together. But then you take that same process and then you do it in another space with different social rules, etc., and then relationships could get ended over something that back home would just be like, yeah, I popped off yesterday, I'm sorry. And so how do you find balance when you're shifting from one space to the next, or regularly going back and forth between spaces, when you're also dealing with emotional content or post-traumatic slave syndrome? Like how do you facilitate those uncomfortable moments that blur between the institutional and the personal?
Is this a question for me or the panel?
Anyone who wants to go.
If you guys don't, I will. No pressure. I don't think you can, to be completely honest, unless you really focus on how trauma is affecting you on a biological level. And I think one thing that the Co-Creation Lab did, and I think Asia, you were part of the first lab, where you focused on how your environment is affecting you and therefore affecting your work. So it's nearly impossible to go back and forth and remain whole. I really, really recommend people having meditative spaces and the ability to deconstruct what's going on, because what you'll start to see happening is that you'll start to replay the same systemic issues that are keeping one oppressed. So I think if we're really talking about not just moving back and forth, but moving forward, we really need to start demanding spaces to heal. And until that's adequately infused in our grant processes, in our labs, in our multiple formats of collaboration, it's going to be like this pendulum swing. Or you're going to have these superstars going, and burning out because they also don't have enough resources to maintain. Did that help, Sultan?
Yes.
Not Joe. Yeah. Any other questions? 5 minutes left.
Can I quickly just give another case? I was working with a person, actually one of my friends who's brain damaged, who almost got killed by a bus, and we were planning on doing a big science and art theater play. And he was out in 8 months, and he still wanted to do it. And the reason why he wanted to do it was because he thought that this bringing back knowledge and doing a theater play of what it means to live with brain damage was a story he could tell that could help him heal from the accident, having a congenital brain damage and then getting acquired brain damage, almost getting killed. But of course the biggest issue here is that scientists have all their deadlines. We had a space at the Royal Danish Theatre, there was a premiere coming up, so how do we create a space for him to heal through it, whereas all of us more or less back off and give him the healing process? So what we did was that we collaborated once more with the Center for Brain Damage, we collaborated with a psychiatrist and psychologist, and then we did a contract saying that they, together with Jakob, always had the veto right to set any conditions they wanted, which means actually we postponed the theater play 1.5 years because continually it was stressing him. But coming out of it, and we did a documentary film about it called Natural Disorder, where you see this process, but coming out of it, it actually helped Jakob to create our own story of what does it mean to have a congenital brain damage and go through a near-death experience, but he did it in his own ways, and us just helping him set the structure.
Any other questions? No. Panelists, do you have any last words? Did I miss a hand?
Just with the last comment.
Sure, please, Gina.
It would be lovely, because I've worked in academia before, it'd be lovely if somebody could have said, my bad, I'm sorry, and get on with it the next day. It would have been beautiful. So I think there's a way that institutions have to change, and I think you're incredibly lucky that you've got that kind of community that you can just resolve things really quickly and move on.
I think we're getting pushed off stage, so very quickly, any last words? No? Thank you so much for being part of this community.
go to lunch and we're about to break, I just have a thought emerging from this particular conversation. I noticed that in all of the conversations thus far, there's been so much emphasis placed on humility and, really subjugating the ego, which I think is incredibly important. And obviously this room is filled with well-intended, lovely people. I do have a thought that I'd like to share and then a question that I'd like folks to reflect on during lunch. So oftentimes, socially, we tend to value technical skills and training that we ascertain from the academy. But when we are talking about and assigning value to things like listening, compassion, love for each other and the planet, equity, we tend to sort of minimize these things. We sort of say it's just informal or it's instinctive or intuitive. And so one of the questions that I have as we go into lunch is, how do we balance humility with assigning a respectful value to the sometimes intangible and informal co-creation practices that are emerging? Because I think that this entire room needs a little more swag. You're all rock stars. I think that this work requires great mindfulness. It is difficult work. You talked about healing. We carry those stories from communities. This is real work. And so I just fear that with all of this talk of humility and, I don't really know what I'm doing, that sort of self-deprecating talk, that we may be subjugating the work beneath sort of like these technical skills and disciplines. And what we want to do is to lift it up because it's important work. It requires rigor, it requires competency, and it's profoundly, profoundly valuable. Let's think about that during